modulation, and I'll let you know that a lot of this information is coming from Stormy Hill, who is an amazing person. She is a doctor who started seeing kids and really loved her job, but was not very satisfied by only having a couple minutes of time with each one, and was really fascinated by kids who had autism or other specific medical care needs, and just didn't feel like she was able to spend enough time with them to see progress. So she went back and got some other credentialing, and she's really focused in sensory modulation now. So this information's coming from her, and I'll give you her contact at the end of this in case you want to reach out. She owns her own company now and consults with schools and rehab facilities and hospitals. So when we're looking at kids who have sensory issues, it's not all about getting sensory. Sometimes it's about seeking sensory or avoiding sensory, or there can even be those that just don't respond to it in an appropriate format. So let's talk about avoiders for a minute. This is the most common category. These individuals are often responsive, overly responsive to different things like sights, smells, noise is a big one. And they have an inability to effectively reduce these sensations. So this is where you see students that cover their ears or yell or act out if a smell gets too strong in a room. Sometimes they have a response that even appears as irritation or pain. They can also be known as having tactile defensiveness, so they might try to get away, they talk their way out of it, they can even become aggressive, showing a fight or flight response. So those are avoiders, and again, those are the most common. Well, then we have seekers. These are folks that just crave some sort of stimulation. They love spinning, or that's where you start seeing kids that stim or flap or even hit themselves or bite themselves. They're craving the stimulation. So they can crave this in many different systems: the touch, the movement, taste, smell. They may even seem like they're never going to be satisfied no matter how much stimulation they're getting in that arena. So higher, faster, and harder seems to be their motto. So you can see these two groups of students are going to be on totally different spectrums of need here. And then we do have under-responders, which means they get less of a response to sensory than other children. So they can act really slowly. For example, if they touch something hot, it might take them a little bit longer to even register pain involved. They may need strong inputs before getting a response. So these might be kids that you see doing something that's actually damaging their skin, the biting, the pinching, the hitting, to get that response. They might not notice experiencing pain, like getting bumped or getting pinched or having a belt that's rubbing on their side. So they might not even notice that. It doesn't mean that it's not doing damage to their tissue. It just means that they're not noticing that. And then typically they are often quiet and withdrawn and prefer to play solitary activities. This can be hard to identify. Just because a child prefers solitary activities doesn't actually mean that's what they want. It just means that they're trying to avoid everything else. It's kind of like when you travel and you can't quite get into the groove. You want to be part of a group. You want to go out and do stuff, but it's just too much effort or too overwhelming to speak the language, understand the dance routines, eat the food, all of that. And so you sit in your room and watch TV while you're in, this amazing place. That can be some of what we see with kids with autism spectrum disorders. Don't misunderstand it that they don't want to do something. It's a matter of just being getting involved in it. Now let's look at some sensory experiences. So the first one we're looking at provides input into joint receptors to help orient us to where our body is in space. So this includes jumping, crashing, heavy work activities, bouncing. These kids kind of need the opportunity to have their body move and feel pressure. So sometimes these students you can see sometimes wearing weighted vests, pushing carts or just pushing up against the wall. That push on their joints just feels really good and releases tension. Now, inhibitory, that's where we start seeing the deep pressure, neutral warmth, vestibular, like swinging, slow vibration, soft music. Those can be really, really helpful. Now, then we have, for kids who are understimulated, this idea of excitement. So light intermittent touch, which is, a soft touch on the hand, almost not quite a tickle, because tickle is seen as an inappropriate word in the school system, but we've seen another process called brushing, so it's just that idea of light touch on skin. Crunchy foods, cold, so whether we touch or it's food, bouncing on a large ball, just rhythmic or fast vestibular, so the idea of kind of feeling knocked off your game, just sitting on a ball and maybe having somebody kind of jostle you back and forth safely, of course, but this can help when kids are understimulated, when they look tired, they're not as excited as the other kids to do something. Some of these things can help bring up their stimulation level. Now, for kids that are overstimulated, we want to decrease all of that. So this falls under organizing. So, for example, this is when we start reducing visual and auditory stimuli, which can be using the cardboard covers for desks so that a student can work without being distracted from their peers. Sometimes we see students that use headphones or something like that to kind of block out noise. Of course, you don't want to over-rely on either of these because there's noise in the environment. We want to sensitize kids to getting used to it, but when they're overstimulated, it's nice to know that blocking those or limiting those can be helpful. Some different sensory play. I'm going to have you look a little bit on Pinterest and get some ideas for sensory ideas. Playing in sand, rolling beads in your hand, having Play-Doh or squishy ball. Those are all great ways to just kind of help decrease stimulation. Heavy work. We see teachers have kids push heavy carts of books from one place to another. Resistive exercise, weight bearing, climbing, all of those things, again, that's kind of pushing into the joints and causing energy to be exerted. Those seem to actually decrease stimulation. It's kind of like for typical kids to go out and do a playground duty. There's a reason that running out on the playground helps so much. Kids with autism spectrum disorder certainly have the same experience, but they might need more than that. Oral motor, so really chewy, caramel-y foods or crunchy kinds of foods, that also can help decrease that energy, that excess that we see. Slow rocking, that's one of the common characteristics of kids with autism, but maybe there could be something more appropriate than a kid just, hugging themselves and rocking back and forth. Maybe they can take a few minutes to go rock on a chair, something that wouldn't look so different in society. And then bear hugs, and this goes back down to providing joint information so that they're releasing those energies. This helps calm. In fact, Temple Grandin, one of her big characteristics is the need to have deep pressure information. So she created her own hugging machine, and that skyrocketed her into working with cattle because it helped calm them on their way to the slaughterhouses. So that is an interesting way that she's made a career out of her own needs that made life feel chaotic and out there. This idea of deep pressure has been very soothing for her. So what does this look like in the classroom? Well, sensory processing disorders could result in coordination problems, issues with fine motor skills, which include handwriting and cutting, and also the whole idea of behavior problems. All of this is also seen so often as behavior problems. Attention span, problems with being able to care for yourself, low self-esteem, unusually high or low activity levels, and even oversensitivity. So let's avoid blaming trap, and I think we do this very well in the severe realm because it's so often just seen as communication for our students. but sometimes we work with students that are a little higher functioning, and especially if you land in some sort of resource collaboration or gen ed collaboration, teachers don't always understand why students do this, and they get into blaming the student for bad behavior. But instead, we want to just take a step back and go basic. Describe what overwhelms the child, what this behavior actually looks like, and identify what helps them from getting overwhelmed in the first place. Often, if we can reduce it or eliminate it altogether, that's very helpful. So, for example, a student identifying that they feel a certain way in their chest, using the temperature scale for a student to request a break when they start getting up into yellow rather than waiting for red, which would be, explosive behavior. Yellow with frustration means they're going to take a few minutes and go jump on a trampoline in the back of the room, for example. So we want to make sure we're providing opportunities for students to get or obtain these sensory inputs and avoid things that are problematic. So loud noises or smells, how can they avoid those if they know they're triggers, and how can they obtain them if they need them? And then also schedule sensory breaks so that kids can take a minute and go bounce on a ball or go play in a sandbox. Just those real specific planning periods on sensory breaks can be the difference between a kid needing full-time pull-outs, severe special ed, and actually being able to stay in a gen ed classroom with just taking a couple sensory breaks. Sometimes it's as simple as Velcro under a desk so that a kid can rub that and feel that, over response in their skin. So it might be very simple like that, and it might be more significant. Depends on the student, but anything that we can do to appropriately bring sensory into the classroom allows the child to stay in a gen ed classroom much longer. So here's some simple strategies. This fits well with Montessori practices for those of you that are in that program, and for those of you that aren't. It's just this idea of high tactile, very functional kinds of routines. Anything that's play-based. It allows students to get messy. Again, that's just giving them tons of sensory information all the time. Sensory breaks, we've talked about music and headphones. Fine motor skills. For example, Writing Without Tears has been a very great program for our students. Dancing, cooking, routines and rituals. You see here on the right-hand side a schedule of events, picture schedules. All of these things are very simple that bring in a lot of sensory and start addressing some of the needs kids have. I'm going to go as far as to say not only are these interventions, but these should be the mainstay of how all classrooms are created, even in the general ed system. The more things that we have that are on this list and beyond, the more that it's enjoyable for kids to play. I mean, for example, fine motor skills, we're talking arts here and dancing, those are some of the pieces we're seeing moved. Sensory breaks, play-based activities, more recess and art, getting messy, exploring sciences. All of these pieces really have a place in special education because it helps address the sensory issues that so many kids, not just kids with ASD, but so many kids have. Now here's some mid-range strategies, okay? So those of us in severe tend to have a little bit of a budget to bring this in, or we get really creative with yard sales and requests from home. But we can start looking at play equipment. So there's therapy balls. Those can be really cheap ones you buy from a basic box store. They do get more and more expensive if you have more money. There's chairs specifically with the bounce ball attached. Tactile balls, those are the ones that kind of have the pokey ends on them, so that gives you a little more physical information. Bolsters, those are just, you see them often in the gym or in physical therapy sessions where the kids can kind of sit on it and stretch their back or move and roll. Sensory bins. On the right hand side you see a typical table. I had one of those for my son. Toys R Us, very, very easy, but there's more expensive ones that are specifically made for sensory issues. You can put water in one side, sand in another. I've seen people make these just out of Tupperware containers. This is one of the things you're going to be looking at on Pinterest as ideas for this. Things that vibrate. It can be simple, timers that kind of vibrate. There's all sorts of little toys. Being a teacher makes you always search for things that you can use in the classroom. So sometimes around the holidays you have those little toys you can wind up and then they bounce. Kids like that sensation on their face, on their hands, on their throats. So having something vibrate is great. Oral motor and oral sensory toys down here. These are those little keychain rings. We've seen kids kind of be able to pull them those, or even put them in their mouth. Be really careful with things that kids can put in their mouths. If they need the strong jaw chewing, clenching kinds of responses, you don't want to give them something that they could break off and choke on. And you also want to be careful that what you're not contributing to is, again, this idea of animalistic training. Because so many animals have chew toys, we want to make sure kids aren't seen as animals who need chew toys. So be very thoughtful about sensory toys. All right, and then we have some really extensive strategies. I'm going to give you a video to watch on a sensory room. They are amazing, and I have seen real sensory rooms. In the past, I've taken the class out to Kari Sue Hamilton or other schools that have specific rooms for sensory. They're beautiful. They can be very expensive, and there's ways that you can make little even teaching closets into a nice sensory room that has things for the sight, smell, sound, motion. So just kind of throwing it out there, up on the ceiling you have these LED lights that can be adapted for a cool down color. So a kid who is overexcited and needs to cool down, you can set them to blue. A kid who needs to get ready to take a test or do something and needs to be raised in their excitement level, you can go up into the reds and oranges. You have the bubble lights, which is, I would love these in my office. They're just very soothing. To some degree, they simulate fish tanks. When at Kari Sue, they have something very similar to what you see in the back right-hand corner, but it's actually a water bed kind of device, and so a kid can lay on it, feel that swervy motion. Sounds can come out of the sides. In this one, you have a swing. Kari Sue even has some smells that come out, so you can put on, again, a lavender to calm or a citrus to kind of raise. So there's lots of things that a sensory room can contain. And again, there's a lot of things you can get from Target or something like that. IKEA has a wonderful group of things that can be adapted. I'll show you an IKEA hacks here in just a minute. On the left-hand side, you see a little boy in Lycra. This is becoming quite popular. We see this more and more in schools. It's just that idea of kind of restricted movement. You notice here, this is not restraint, so be really careful about thinking restraint is the same, but it's just forcing a kid to, again, have a little more information being sent to their joints, a little more pushback. I've seen Lycra swings where a kid gets in and the swing is attached to beams in the ceiling, and the kid just kind of squirms in the bag and is also being rocked and just comes out as a very different, calm student that is ready to work. So these are intensive strategies because they can cost more. They probably need their own area. This is where you start getting into a different room. So a kid you might have a sensory station in the school so the kid can leave and do this. Ball pits, cushions, climbing and sliding equipments, carpeted equipments, Lycra. All of these kinds of things are wonderful strategies, but they're not necessarily easy and cheap to install. So they might be across time, and think of writing a grant for something like this. For more information, the Out of Sync child book series is awesome. It is just chock full of all sorts of ideas related to ways to help students, and you can find it on Amazon. Your basic Barnes & Noble carries it. They have several different ones. Out of Sync Child Has Fun is a really great one that comes up with a bunch of ideas. Pinterest, this is one of your assignments today, is you're going to be looking for sensory-based ideas on Pinterest. And then also, if you have a really tough case, there are professional consultants. Busy Bee Therapy Services, Stormy Hill has created this business and has therapists that can come out to schools and provide consultation services. And so here is their website as well. So I'm going to just touch base on a couple of research-based practices that bring in sensory to learning that are very specific to students with disability. And so we're not just trying to do anything works. If this is a cool toy, let's use it. Let's ground it in research. So the first thing is applied behavior analysis, which is incredibly popular, very important for those on the spectrum in particular, but works well with others. And this is just this idea of typically working one-on-one with a child, teaching specific manageable skills. You can see down in the picture, the little boy is putting together a puzzle while the instructor is taking data on if he's following directions. ABA allows us to increase the opportunities that a student takes to respond and may require a form of reinforcement. It can be as low as, hey, good job. It can be very verbal. We can get more intensive with kids earning tokens towards some sort of preferred reinforcer also. So DIR is developmental individual difference relationship-based therapy. This is really focused on early intervention, so we don't see this oftentimes in the school because we're really looking at kids 2 to 5 years old. This is friendly, but it's also challenging learning experiences with really small kids, and it teams the parents with the professionals, which I love because this really ties into special ed nicely. And it fosters social and emotional health. So most of it's through play. There's a lot of benefit to the parents because they understand the difference between encouraging a child and doing something for a child. When you have a child with a disability, you get in the habit very quickly of doing things for them instead of helping them learn to do it themselves. So this type of experience, if you're working with younger kids or perhaps even older kids who might need more floor time, this is a great opportunity. Now, the PEC system you're probably already familiar with, but this idea of assisting students with communication skills, and that these systems can be really simple, but they can also be complex just depending on the student's skill level. And it allows children to exchange a picture for something they want. And it slowly builds social behavior because they're interacting, they're bringing these things to their teacher to request, or they're putting multiple together to build their communication as they're getting older. Another one is social stories. This describes difficult situations and helps students identify what would be relevant social cues, relevant perspectives, common responses, and it also provides an opportunity for them to practice those appropriate responses. So this builds really great pro-social behavior, and it's kinesthetic because you're acting it out, you're using the iPad. There's been some great social stories apps on the iPad recently. So there's lots of things you can do with social stories, but it's very hands-on. Teach is structured teaching with visual supports. So I pulled up an example. What this is providing explicit instruction and visual supports within a structured environment, and this increases imitation, gross motor skills, hand-eye coordination, and cognitive performance. Again, all of these tasks are very sensory motivated, but you can see here this would be a simple sorting activity where you're trying to match the color of these bolts on the left-hand side with the color of the holes that they're in. This is a really cheap and easy thing to find. You can just find any kinds of toys. This teacher is colored in a carton. This is one such idea you can find on Pinterest. And then we have discrete trial training, which you guys will obviously write an instructional program on. This is very similar to ABA. It can focus on 2 to 6 year olds, but we often see discrete trial training all the way through school systems. It takes a simple tasks and leads to mastery of a skill. So in essence, discrete trial training, as I mentioned several weeks ago, it might not serve a functional purpose by itself, but in coordination with others, it builds skills. So it's really useful in teaching letters, numbers, names, sight words. we have to move those skills into something and ground them into a function. For example, what's the importance of a number unless I'm adding it or using it to find directions? Just to know the name of a number for its own purpose might not lead to a functional skill. But discrete trial training is great because in kind of a ABA format, kids are learning very useful things.